You can get Sons of Patriarchy completely ad-free on Apple Podcasts for $4.99 per month or $44.99 per year. This applies to our entire back catalog and every upcoming episode completely ad-free. Listening without interruption. If you don't mind the ads, you can still listen to the series for free on any of your favorite podcast platforms. This revenue helps support Outreach Idaho and helps pay the bills of the series. Now, on to the episode. Quick announcement before we start this episode. We've launched our website and initial line of merch. Go to sonsofpatriarchy.com and pick up a t-shirt, a sticker, or a crew neck fleece, or all three. And wait till you see our design. We went bold. A link to the website is in our show notes, or simply type sonsofpatriarchy.com into your search bar. Now, on with today's conversation. All right, we have the last, at least, of our initial batch of those from the CPC, the Covenant Presbyterian Church denomination, Heritage CPC in particular, but also a few other CPCs in general, and just the culture in general. Some of the things they've covered up, some of the things they care about, their culture, their theology, everything else. So if you can start off by talking about how you got introduced to this church in general. If you're born into it, your first memories of it. So what was it like when you were first introduced, or your first memories in the CPC?
So I was raised Christian by my parents. I grew up in primarily Reformed Baptist churches. And then when I was around 11, I believe, my parents and obviously me and my sister joined a CPC church in Texas by the name of Crown and Covenant. And very quickly after joining there, my father began the process of becoming a pastor there because it was a single elder church and they were in need of some help. So we very quickly moved into church membership and my father becoming a pastor. And we were there for several years. In that time, there were various minor church splits and various upsets within the church that I do not recall in enough detail to speak about because of how young I was. But primarily, I just remember the attitude towards my family souring in the church. People had a less than positive opinion of my father's preaching, and my sister, especially in her social group. There was just some immature behavior happening in the teenagers of that group, and they were not treating each other very well. But, teenagers, it happens. But over time, it just became such an issue with the fact that my dad's preaching and the other elders' preaching were contradicting each other in the pulpit, that my parents chose to start going to other churches around the time that we started talking about moving out of the state. And some various things happened in our personal life that caused my mother a lot of distress, and she had a lot of mental health issues. So my father wanted to help her, and he thought that the best way to do that would be to move us to Tennessee, because he had heard about Heritage, and he had heard it's this group of Christians who all live near each other, and they have a great community, and they spend all their time together around other Christians who are like-minded. And so he thought it would help my mother to be in an environment that was so, as it was described to us, so peaceful and welcoming and helpful. And he just thought, that would be a good environment to let the family heal a little bit after several years of strife within our family. And we moved there, and it was readily apparent that things were not as they had been described to us. Um, I distinctly recall on my first Sunday attending Heritage Church, as after we had officially moved there, because we visited once or twice before, I remember adult women to my face referring to me as fresh blood. And I was at the time 16 or 17. And I was referred to as fresh blood because they have all intermarried each other and options are becoming limited. And they referred to me and my sister as such. And I was initially obviously very jarring and bizarre, but I didn't think much of it because I didn't really have the context of how weird that is to say to a kid at the time. I then, because I was in private school, I was not homeschooled like everyone else there. I was on an online private school. I was then lectured for nearly 2 hours by a woman in her 50s about how immoral it would be for a woman like me to attend college because that was not my place. I basically have no use for that education if I'm just going to be a wife and mother. That would be wasting my time. And so that was the environment within the first couple of weeks of getting there. And I don't have the email, but whenever we moved there, my father received an email from Marion Lovett with a recommended dress code for living in the area. Obviously not enforced because that's not, they don't own the property we were living on. But it was just like, if you were going to be out walking on the road where other people in the church can see you, we would appreciate if you follow a neck to knee dress code for your daughters to avoid stumbling blocks, etc. Very common rhetoric for dress codes in churches like this. But that did not make me and my sister feel particularly welcomed to hear that if we want to go take a walk on the road in front of our house, they expect us to wear pants or a long skirt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was interesting
Yep.
to walk into. But that was the environment of like first showing up to Heritage after having been at a separate CPC church for 4 or 5 years. It was discouraging because we were realizing, oh, it's just going to be more of the same, more of what we left behind. We thought we were done with this, but I guess not. And then other issues with my mother's mental health sort of took priority, so I didn't care all that much about the church environment, but that was the initial impression.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we heard from 3 previous women about the culture at the church. So we talked about this, how you got introduced to the church, your first impressions of the church. So let's talk about you've been there for a little bit, a few months. What did you notice about the culture? See, that was your first initial impression,
Mm-hmm.
which is not a good impression at all. But what was it like at the church? What was the preaching like? What was the culture like? How were men viewed? How were women viewed? What was all of that like?
The culture was it was very similar to what I was used to, having already been in the CPC church. I didn't really know any different because that's what I was raised in. I didn't like it, but I always thought that was like, I always felt a lot of guilt about the fact that I didn't like the way everything was because, oh, this is how God wants it to be. So I must be sinning by not wanting to live this life. Because I always very privately, like, I didn't want to have children. I didn't really want to just like get married at 18 like all the other girls did. I didn't want to do all of that. And it made me very nervous that I didn't want to because that was just, everyone talked about it like it was the perfect life. So it was certainly a lot of pressure put on women to be, the cookie cutter housewife. But I was also at the time, I was having some social issues. Again, I was a teenager, and in my school, most of my friends were boys. And I guess that's just who I was drawn to for friends at the time. And I started talking to other people my age in church, And I would get genuine like looks of disapproval if I tried to talk to one of the guys, just even in a friendly way, because it was considered inappropriate, I guess. And so it was just a lot of like deliberately creating a divide between genders unnecessarily. Very much a sort of lesser than and greater than divide. It was like, oh, they have a higher calling than us, basically. That was never said to me, but that was the sort of attitude that I was picking up on. But as far as like the culture, I didn't really mind it because there were so many activities. There was always something, somebody was always having some kind of event at their house. It was always fun. You got to play volleyball or sing or do whatever. They created a welcoming environment as far as giving you fun things to do to fill your time. And as I said, I was heavily preoccupied with a lot of issues in my family because my mother had become, due to her mental health issues, had become quite physically abusive. And my family was just trying to deal with that. So I was very distracted from the church environment. And on top of that, was trying to still do school and everything. But at first, everyone seemed very helpful. And like one of the local, one of the families in the church offered my sister a job because the, like, in the way I was raised, it was considered acceptable for a young woman to work as long as she was working for someone who was a Christian, because then her authority figures in her life are still Christian. So she was still under Christian headship. It was a very, like, basically you can't do anything unless you're under the authority of a Christian, was sort of the mindset. But my sister was allowed to do that work. She was also in her 20s at the time. So she would spend most of her days working for this family, and just things at home just got worse. I know my father reached out to Marion and Keith and requested some kind of help, but they were not helpful. They showed up once or twice to try to like peacefully talk to my parents, I think, but when that didn't work, they just stopped showing up. They stopped answering the phone because I guess it was a case too difficult for them to deal with. But eventually, my father was going to take my mom to a hospital in South Carolina that was known for helping people with mental health struggles. And he was going to leave me and my sister in the house that he had rented out there since we were, comfortable being left alone. She was in her 20s, I was in my teens. And he was just going to let Marion and Keith know, like, I'm leaving my daughters here. If, a bunch of people in this church live on the same road, if you guys just don't mind keeping an eye on the house, making sure they're safe. And Marion basically replied saying, you can do what you want, but we cannot accept any more single women in the church. We are like at capacity for caring for single women because there are already 3 or 4 women living out from under their father's house at the time who were attending the church. And so he just flat out told my father that we would not be accepted as in the church as women who were not under their father at the moment, even though it was a temporary trip. So that's when I started seeing, oh, they don't actually care about helping us. They just care about the reputation they have. They care about having the reputation that they do, very welcoming and helpful, but they don't actually back it up when you need it. So that's when I sort of checked out as far as, well, I mean, to be blunt, that's when I lost utter respect for Marion Lovett.
Hmm. Um, so is that when you started? So you said this is in your teens. Is that when you started questioning this church? Like maybe, yeah,
Yeah.
it's this is a community oriented, fun place. There's a lot of things to do, but maybe they're not like maybe that's sort of a veneer of things that are actually going on in this church. Is that what you're catching?
Yes, and I was also at the time befriending people like Alexandria who were being this it hadn't quite happened yet, but she was already being treated badly, and I was seeing it going towards the direction of her being directly shunned. Like that's what was happening, and she was a friend of mine. There were also some friends I had made who went to a similar church who was not affiliated to the CPC, but they were also leaving that church. And so just hearing them talk about these theologies that I was raised to believe were completely normal and just what you should believe, they were starting to step back and examine those with more criticism. And I would hear those conversations, and I didn't agree with them at first, but I kind of had the mentality that I was raised to have, which was, well, I'll stay friends with them and I can, I can be an evangelist to them. I can help them not lose the faith. That was sort of where I was in my headspace. And then they started making sense. And it was certainly disruptive to my worldview, but I just sort of didn't talk about it for a while because I knew that, I mean, what could be done? I have to live with my parents. I'm not old enough to move out. I don't have a job, all of these things. So, but yeah, becoming friends with these people not only did, create a genuine community for me, not the one that was a facade, but it also just helped contextualize the way other people were being treated in this church, especially the other women around me and my sister's age.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, your story is a little different from many that we profiled, and even those within this little series in the CPC, because it was your mom being abusive to your dad, and obviously the mental health issues being
Mm-hmm.
a large part of that. How is that approached? You talked about this a little bit. How is that approached or understood or dealt with or whatever it may be from CPC, from Marion, from others? You said it was like too complicated a case, but what did that look like for them trying to understand mental health, your mom, and all this stuff that was happening?
I don't really remember. I have trouble with my memories from that time period just because of all the stress I was under.
Yeah.
Um, but I was not privy to the conversations that Marion and Keith had with my parents.
Hmm.
It was, I believe, they were attempting, like, basically emergency marriage counseling.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't think I don't really blame Marion and Keith for this, but I don't think they understood the extreme to which my mother was struggling. I don't think they comprehended how much she had gone through already and how much of a toll it had taken on her psyche. I mean, I am only just now starting to put some of those pieces together, and I was living with her.
Yeah.
So I don't really fault them for not understanding how she genuinely was doing,
Yeah, of
but
course.
they did not try enough, is one thing I will say.
Hmm.
They didn't really know what to do with her, I don't think, and I also don't think they realized how abusive she was, because I don't think my dad was being very open about that, because I think he was, obviously it was distressing for him to talk
Yeah.
about or to even acknowledge. So
There could be something
I
embarrassing about it for him too, where he's supposed to be the patriarch, the leader of the family, the head of the family. As you said, the woman has to
mhm.
be under the head, and if his wife is being abusive to him, how does he explain this to the leadership? Is like, I can't lead her because she's being abusive. Now I'm the victim, and that could be a weird place for somebody in that situation to explain to church leaders who expect him to keep his wife in line.
Right. Yeah. I'm not entirely sure what approach they took, but it obviously was not effective. Um, but yeah, it after Marion had told my dad that me and my sister would not be welcomed as like women out front of their father in the church, um, then my family ended up like we all took a trip together to South Carolina to try to help her. And then various things ensued with my family. We ended up in Mississippi, where her extended family is, where my mom's parents are, and the violence just kept increasing and getting more dangerous and more difficult to calm her down and everything like that. And my sister had had enough reasonably, so she basically packed everything in her car and decided to go move in with a friend down in Texas where we used to live. So she just drove away, and my mom literally got in her car to chase her down. And my dad like had both of their locations and was realizing my mom was chasing her across state lines. So he knew that when she got back, it would be a dangerous situation for us. And we made an emergency decision to also just drive away. So we left my mom with a car and our RV so that she would still have a place to stay. She would still be able to do what she wanted, but we wouldn't be with her. And we packed everything into my dad's car. We moved back to Tennessee because my father already purchased a home there because we were planning to move there, but obviously that hadn't happened yet. So we just went back and kind of fell into a routine of just go to church, or I fell into a routine of go to church, do school, see my friends, repeat basically. But I, at that point, was heavily checked out from Heritage. I didn't want to be there, but that's where my dad was going to church, and I didn't have a driver's license or a car, so I guess that's where I have to go to church too, was kind of the mentality. I was still attempting to make some friends there to make the best of it, but none of them were really willing to speak to me beyond pleasantries, which my father did actually ask Marion about. And he was like, why are all the young people in the church just disregarding my daughter? And Marion's response was probably because they see on Instagram the kinds of friends that she has.
Hmm.
And the kinds of friends that I had were other people who had stepped away from Heritage and the other church similar to it in the area. And I was openly, spending time with them, but I didn't think anything of it because they were still Christian people.
Yeah.
They just didn't go to the approved churches. So they went to non-denominational churches, which was that was basically considered not really going to church in these circles, was going to a non-denominational church. So that was, yeah, so Marion didn't even try to hide the fact that they were just shunning me because I had the wrong friends. But after that, my dad spoke to Keith Bradshaw again, kind of requesting advice on what he should do about the fact that my mother was still calling him every day to scream at him and all these things. She was still being abusive from a distance. And Keith advised that they try to work on their marriage. And he advised that my dad let my mom come back and live with us in Tennessee again, because he basically said it was wrong for them to be living apart as a married couple. And I begged him not to do that. I begged Keith not to tell him to do that. I remember being in my living room and hearing Keith Bradshaw recommend that my dad let my mom come live with us again, and immediately speaking up, which I tried to avoid talking to Marion and Keith at the time, but immediately speaking up and saying, no, that isn't the solution. Like, I've lived through them trying this. It isn't the solution. And he didn't really seem to believe me or really care about my opinion. And this was also around the time that my father and I were being barred from the table because
For what?
Because it had been so long since we attended the church in Texas where our membership was. They were just going to remove us from the rolls. if we couldn't find somewhere to transfer our membership. And we had requested to transfer our membership to Heritage, but they basically said we could not join the church until my parents had worked out their marriage, because they wouldn't allow us to join unless we were a family unit as opposed to individual people.
Hmm.
And this was the first thing that they did that really like distressed me on a spiritual level, because the idea of being
Yeah,
barred from the table was,
it's a big deal. Yeah.
yeah, especially since the culture I was raised in, that was only reserved for if you do something really, really bad.
Hmm.
Like that was, I had seen people in our Texas church be barred from the table, and it was due to sexual immorality. And I was like, well, we didn't do anything bad like that. So why is this happening? Um, and I had actually, at this point, I was about halfway through 17. I was nearly 18. And I asked Keith, well, can I not just join on my own? As an adult, let me just join the church as my own person, separate from my family. And he basically said no. Again, the limit on how many single young women they'll allow.
So they
And
legitimately had a limit on single young women that they would allow into
I
the church.
I don't think it was a number limit. I think
Yeah.
it was a how much work they were requiring limit.
Yeah. So effectively
Um,
a number limit, even if they wouldn't say a number limit. It's if we have too many of these, then it throws off our numbers. We need more family
yeah,
units, not single people.
yeah. And I then requested to Keith. I was like, okay, then don't bar me from the table, and just basically I basically was requesting to have my membership sort of held in limbo until my parents got their marriage together, and just don't bar me from the table because I am not a part of their marriage.
Yeah,
I
they're
can't
barring
control
you
what
from
they
the
do.
table, not for something that you did, but something like they're not allowing you membership, and then they're barring you for the table for not being members at the
Yes,
church.
precisely. That is exactly what happened. And I remember asking Keith, can I just don't bar me from the table? Just like let me give me more time, basically, before I'm removed from the rolls. And this man looked me in the eyes and said, "You are paying for the sins of your father." He was in our house and he said that to me, and I
Paying for
just got
what
up and walked
sins?
away. Well, I mean, they considered it sinful that my parents were married and not living together.
Okay. Even though your mom had severe mental health issues and it was not healthy for them to be in the same place at the same time.
Yes, but I think they just considered it as a like that's your problem. You should figure that out kind of thing. I'm not sure, but that seemed the attitude that they had about it.
Yeah, it's like marriage. We've talked about this before. Marriage at all costs. It doesn't matter how
Hmm.
bad it is, doesn't matter the destruction in the marriage, doesn't matter the abuse in the marriage. You got to be married, and we don't care what it takes.
Yeah, that was very much the energy around young people, especially if you were reaching adulthood and you didn't have a courtship perspective, then there was something wrong.
Hmm.
Because I mean, it was like known in the church that there were various people who at like 14, 15, 16, it was like, oh yeah, they're gonna get married when they're 18. It's just gonna happen. There were just people who were already paired off as children because it was just like,
Children.
oh well, I mean, yeah, I mean, early teens
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's still a
being,
child. Anything below 18 is still a child.
yeah, but especially like they certainly did not have the maturity to be making those sort of decisions.
No.
And their parents were not saying, hey, maybe you hold off on this. It was just like, okay, at least you'll be married, kind of, kind
Yeah,
of thing.
yeah. I'm still stuck
Um,
on Keith telling you you're paying for the sins of your father, which is,
yeah, I never asked for clarification on what he meant by that because I walked out of the room.
yeah, I'd imagine.
I was not tolerating that kind of mentality anymore. I attended Heritage that following Sunday, and then I started going to church with my friends after that. Um, I went back a couple times for various like baptisms and things like that of people who I would have felt bad if I missed. But other than that, I just checked out after that. especially since I was also looking into what they actually believed, and I heard which has already been addressed on this program, but Marion talking about how basically a woman can't get to God but through a man,
Hmm.
and I was like, well, that doesn't seem right, and I started.
Nor biblical in any sense of the imagination.
Yeah, I that was when I started actually studying the Bible on my own. Previously, it was always like in church or in like family Bible time. I never really cared to read it on my own. But it was just a I have to prove him wrong thing that made me start reading the Bible more.
Yeah.
And I started looking into, that statement specifically is what I wanted to pick apart. And I basically realized that it had no basis in scripture in any way, and that he made it up for, I can only assume, to control the women in his church and his wife, and that left a very bad taste in my mouth. And I just disregarded him after that. This is harsh wording, but I wrote him off as a heretic because I
Yeah.
couldn't believe that he actually said that in the pulpit and meant it. Um, And I also had a friend at the time who I believe this has already been spoken about as well, but a man in the church who was exclusively showing interest in girls who were 17. Um, and one of my friends had been one of those girls, but she was older now and she had stopped attending the church. But he was starting to show interest in her younger sister who had just turned 17,
How old is this guy again?
32 at the time.
Okay. I just want to establish that on the front end so it's clear that he
Yeah,
was.
yeah. This was not some teenager. This was a grown man in his 30s who would deliberately befriend teenage girls. And
Yeah. That's 2 years younger than me.
ever
I'm 34, and that is disgusting.
yeah, he and if anyone from Heritage is listening to this, they know who I'm talking about because it was common knowledge that this is what he did and everyone just would have laughed it off.
Yeah.
Deliberate predatory behavior was just written off as, oh well, he's harmless. It's like
Yeah. He's
I
harmless
doubt
besides
that
being a
actually.
predator. Yeah.
Yeah. But they didn't see it as predatory because he just wants to make these young women a wife. That's
Yeah.
that's a
There's
great
there's a there's a
calling.
word for this. It's even more particular than predator. He's a pedophile.
Yeah,
That's what you're
that
called
is.
when you're interested in people who are underage.
Yeah, and I that is another reason I quit attending the church is because I would be spending time with my teenage friends during the church potluck, and he would always be at the table with us. And it made me very uncomfortable to the point I even told my father. At this point, I wasn't talking to my dad very much. I told my father, I was like, please, if I am ever like going outside by myself or whatever, and you see, please don't leave me alone with him ever. Like, I don't feel safe around this man. I think he's dangerous. And and my father actually agreed that he didn't like the way that this man acted. Um, yeah, uh, it was not a good situation for any of these young women to be in, certainly.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, but when you're marriage at all cost,
mm-hmm.
and you can write off some of this stuff as like, well, he's just looking for his wife. She may be younger, but he's looking for his wife.
Yeah, yeah, and that was considered acceptable.
Yep. Yep. Um, and you also, I got some notes about your stuff too. Um, you said you were allowed to attend school. So you had a desire to have an education, which kind of who doesn't want to receive an education? Um, can you like what's for those who are not familiar with these extremely conservative and strict churches and denominations, um, what is why is it weird for women to have, or I guess, what is the view of women and education, women receiving an education? Because for anybody outside the church, it's like, well, of course you're going to have an education just as much as a man's going to have an education. But why is that considered? Like you had to express a desire to be educated versus like, well, of course she's gonna be educated because she's a kid and she needs to go to college, she needs to get a job and have a career, maybe have a family if she wants to, just like if a guy does too. Um, why'd you have to express a desire to have an education?
Well, as far as high school education went, it was a little taboo that I was not homeschooled.
Yeah.
But because it was an online private school, so I still spent all my days at home. I
Okay.
didn't go physically to school. That made it a little more acceptable, and
Okay.
it
So you're at
was
home doing school, just not being home.
precisely, and it was a conservative Christian school as well. That like a huge part of the curriculum for
Yeah.
every
Veritas
class, even
Online, right?
yeah, yeah. I wasn't sure if you're familiar, but yeah,
We're
Veritas
very
Scholars
familiar.
Academy,
Trust me.
very, very, very Christian
Yeah.
to a fault in some
Oh yeah,
cases.
to a fault and very particular views on some historical events.
Yeah, I was, they're a creationist. Like my history classes taught create young Earth creationism.
Hmm.
So as did my science courses. There were parts in our science textbooks we were recommended to disregard because they used the phrases millions of years.
Okay.
Um, and it was like, okay, well, we know that's wrong. Just ignore it. It's we found the best textbook we could, basically,
Yeah.
um, and things like that. But because that was the environment I was being schooled in, my high school education, me getting a high school education was not actually that frowned upon,
Hmm.
especially in the Texas CPC church, because one of the families attending there, the father was a teacher at this school. So it was much more normalized there because, all of his kids were obviously enrolled in the school because he was a teacher there. And that's how we heard about it. And it was like, okay, it's a Christian school. Like, you're still under the authority of Christian teachers and a Christian headmaster and Christian school owners and all of that. So it was considered acceptable. But the reason, I mean, my parents were actually open to me going to college. That is one thing that they never really cared about other people disapproving of that, which I did appreciate. I
Hmm.
did, in the end, decide not to go to college, but for very different reasons.
Sure. Yeah. Your
Um,
decision.
but this has, I was going to say I've never heard anyone blatantly say this, but I actually have. The reason it's frowned upon for women to go to college is just quite frankly, you're wasting your fertile years, is the phrase I have heard used,
Okay.
which is alarming considering most people graduate college around 22 or 23
You're still,
if you're
yeah,
just getting a bachelor's degree.
to use the kind of weird language. You're still fertile at 22.
Yeah. And also, you're still, I mean, some would argue, still too young to get married in some cases.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, obviously that's a case to case
Yeah, of
basis
course.
thing,
If you're
but
ready to get married and you want to get married younger after 18, go for it. If you're mature and you have your life
yeah,
together, absolutely. But yeah, if you're not,
yeah,
then yeah, you need to wait to be ready to get married
yeah,
if
and
you want to
it's
get married at all. It's not like not everyone has to get married. And if you want to get married, then that's a different issue.
but yeah, it was certainly seen as a waste of money and time if you were a woman going to college because you're just going to get married and have babies and raise them at home. Now, there were some wives of well regarded men in Heritage who had college degrees, and basically their workaround for not disapproving of these women was because, well, they're using it to teach their children, which fair enough, I guess, but they just refuse to acknowledge the hypocrisy there.
Yeah, but
It's
it's
like,
because they're married to highly regarded men at the church.
and
It's
and they
your
have more
marriage.
than 5 children, so they didn't waste their youth.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah. If they weren't married to somebody who was highly regarded and if they didn't use their education to teach their children, um, then your education is worthless. I mean, not to not to mention it's worth it for the person receiving it, but
Yeah.
if you don't use it, if you're not utilitarian and you don't use it in a way that directly benefits who they say it should benefit, then it's useless.
knowledge for the sake of knowledge was really only regarded as respectable for the church figures. The elders and pastors and deacons were the only ones who were encouraged to pursue knowledge for no reason, basically, unless
Like
they were the ones
personal
who were
enrichment.
expected to study. Yeah. But as far as your average layman, you were just anticipated to, yes, you're supposed to read the Bible at home and all of that, but your pastor will tell you what you need to know,
Yeah,
basically.
and that's the reason
Hey,
why they don't want you to be educated is so your pastor can tell you what you need to know, and you have no reason to question what your pastor is telling you to do.
this was actually another thing that caused me to be more skeptical of the CPC as a whole, is because so many of their beliefs, like what we just discussed, and their strong requirement for like biblical liturgy as opposed to just worship, they had it had to be very structured and follow a liturgy. That all of that combined with some of their beliefs had a taste of Catholicism to it. And I was in Veritas Scholars Academy, which is openly anti-Catholic. And so I had these sort of things that were clashing in my mind, and I was like, okay, they can't both be right, and I think both of them are wrong, actually. So it was like from school, I was getting like to the point of a problematic dislike of Catholicism, to the point that students who were Catholic were being bullied and the administration didn't care. And then going to church, and yes, obviously Presbyterians are very Protestant, but some of these things just had such a tinge of old structured religion that it counteracted a lot of the teaching that I was receiving, just because they didn't mesh.
Mm-hmm. Um, so not jumping ahead in the story, but now
Mm-hmm.
looking back, you may not have had language for some of this stuff growing up. But how did you eventually start naming this for what it was, either abuse or covering up or them not coming to help your father or your family, or they just didn't know where to like go to a professional counselor, go to this professional agency, whatever, like they don't have to be omnicompetent. They shouldn't be omnicompetent. They should know like, hey, we need help from our community. We need help from secular organizations, from Christian organizations to help us out. When did that become maybe not clear for you, but clearer for you? We started naming this for what it was.
Um, I think it certainly became more clear for me once I moved out and started living on my own,
Okay.
which I did a few months after graduating high school. Um, but looking back, I think the sort of where that seed was planted was when my sister and I, at a certain point, whenever my family was living in South Carolina, um, my sister and I felt the need to run away for our own safety because of how violent my mother had become. And we sought refuge with a pastor of a church in South Carolina who was very welcoming and very helpful. And to this day, I am so grateful for him and his wife and everything they did for us. They let us stay in their guest house for nearly a month and just let us have some peace
Yeah.
and just some time healing. And I remember talking to him, and he mentioned that pastors are mandatory reporters,
Yep.
and that was something I didn't know
You're not,
because
yeah, especially these churches, you're not supposed to know that. Yeah, for sure.
yeah, because there had been blatant abuse that I had witnessed. I had friends who I knew went to pastors and told them about abuse and all of these things, and it was never reported. And it was shocking to me that that was their legal responsibility. I had never heard that.
Yep.
And it was an interesting narrative shift for me, learning that they were breaking the law to cover up the people in their churches who were doing these things. And um, that was a while before I ended up leaving Heritage, but I remember that being a sort of something in the back of my mind, as they just have never mentioned that this is their responsibility, and they blatantly neglect this responsibility. But yeah, the big shift of recognizing what was abuse and how deep it ran was after I moved out and could have these conversations with myself in an environment that was not controlled
Hmm.
by these people. To a degree, I was still, the apartment I was living in was still owned by one of the men who went to
Yeah.
Heritage. But
Yeah, it's a slow transition out. I mean,
yeah,
it's not usually just cold turkey, you're out of it. Because your lives are so entrenched in these communities because that's what they try to do. They, whether intentionally or unintentionally, they want to make sure you are so enmeshed in this community that it's almost impossible to get out. I mean, your life is revolves around this. Your job may be from people in this church, like you said, you're renting from people in this church. Um, it's not as easy to just kind of cut ties and go.
yeah, I didn't truly feel like I could openly express my um, theological and especially my political views until late last year, October of last year, because that's when I was let go from my job where I was working for people. It was not, they were not from Heritage, but they were from the other churches I have mentioned who had very similar beliefs and were in
Sure,
the same
sure.
area. So I didn't even feel like I could express my opinions without risking my job up
Yeah,
until very
especially in election
recently.
season. Yep. Especially in
Yeah.
October.
Yeah. Even though I would sit there and hear other people expressing their opinions
Yeah.
and vehemently disagreeing,
Yep,
but
yep.
knowing I can't say something because I will take a chance of losing my job
I
over it.
get you. Yep.
And this is just an aside, but my employers from this culture who grew up in these churches, after I no longer worked there, they outed me to my family unprompted. So that they just, these people just have no respect for people's privacy and peace of mind.
Yeah,
Unless
especially
you
those who are
agree, you
different than
don't
them.
deserve their respect, basically.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So this is not necessarily just a question, but as we end, um, I asked this of other women in the CPC that we've talked to before you, and then other people in other churches, other denominations. Um, if you could talk to Heritage CPC about what you went through, about your cries for help, your family's cries for help, your father's cries for help, that were either ignored, diverted, not known what to do with, or like Keith said, the sin's placed on you, and then you're the one who's forced to deal with it. What would you tell Heritage? Because they'll email me, which I know they already have emailed me, and I'm having fun with those emails. But they can't. So it's been them speaking for so long, and you've been the one silenced, and now you're the one who's speaking, and they can't say anything back to you. So what would you tell them?
Well, I would like to start by saying there are people in these churches, in Heritage and Crown and Covenant and the entire CPC, who are genuinely good hearted Christians who are doing their best. And all of these negative things that I'm saying, they're not about you. You are the victim here as well. Like, I don't, there are a lot of people in these places I do not hold accountable for the things that have happened to me.
Yep.
And I'm eternally grateful for how much they have helped my sister in things I have not brought up because it's not my story to share.
Yeah.
But you have been a lifeline to her in some difficult times, and I will forever be grateful for that. However, those of you who have perpetrated, hidden, and encouraged abuse, you will you will see God one day, and I hope you remember that as you continue to treat people the way that you are.
And then
And I think that's it.
um, can you also talk to, and if you're not comfortable, if you don't want to, if you've already said it, that's perfectly fine. If you can talk to Marion and Keith. the leadership, the leaders at Heritage, and then other leaders of CPCs who might be listening, what would you tell the leadership at Heritage about what you've been through?
Um, I would say to Marion and Keith especially, and also extending this to the elder at Crown Covenant, Peter Allison. Um, I think the way that you have treated myself and countless others is vile and irredeemable. And I hope that you repent because you are just harming people for the sake of it, mindlessly and repeatedly harming people to make yourself feel more powerful. And that's revolting.
Well, thank you for telling your story. Thank you for your courage, your bravery. I tell people I am not the brave one on Sons of Patriarchy. I just record and bully bullies. But thank you for coming on, telling your story, and then hopefully helping others gain some language for what might be happening to them.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing these stories and giving them outreach.